we're not ready to fight anybody right now, certainly not the Russians. So I don't think that's likely to happen. And as deranged and corrupt as I think Washington is at this point, I don't think they're foolish enough to threaten a nuclear exchange with Russia, because everyone knows what a nuclear exchange with Russia would create. It would be the end of us. The world that we know would cease to exist. So I don't think that's likely. And I think increasingly, the attention is going to refocus now on the Middle East. We are already shifting whatever resources and munitions and capabilities we have to Israel, that is engaged in building the foundation for a regional war against all of Islam. That's where we're headed in the Middle East. And the principal goal that Mr. Netanyahu has is very similar to Mr. Zelensky's goal. Mr. Zelensky's goal was always to drag us into war with Russia on his behalf. That has failed. That's not going to happen. Now Mr. Netanyahu is desperate to drag us into war against all of his erstwhile enemies, which means virtually everybody in the Middle East, and expect us to destroy them for Israel. And we are poised to do that. We are poised right now to attack Iran and potentially Hezbollah and presumably anybody else who decides to raise objections to what Israel is doing in Gaza.
Douglas Macgregor's sharp, unapologetic assessment of the current state of U.S. military readiness and Washington's foreign policy gives us a stark picture of the geopolitical landscape. His remarks echo a broader sentiment of frustration and concern about the U.S.'s entanglement in conflicts across the world, particularly with Russia and now increasingly in the Middle East. Macgregor starts by addressing a critical issue: the U.S.'s readiness for military confrontation, particularly with Russia. According to him, Washington simply isn't ready to engage in any significant military conflict. And while relations with Russia remain tense, Macgregor argues that even Washington's political class, despite its flaws, isn't reckless enough to risk a nuclear exchange with Russia, a catastrophic event that would fundamentally alter life on Earth. However, the conversation quickly shifts to another region where tensions are rising: the Middle East. Macgregor argues that the U.S. is already shifting its focus, resources, and military capabilities toward Israel as it prepares for what could be a broader regional war. This conflict would pit Israel against much of the Muslim world, a prospect that Macgregor suggests has been Netanyahu's goal for some time. Let's dive deeper into these points and explore the broader implications of what Macgregor is describing. Macgregor's assertion that the U.S. is not ready to fight anyone, especially Russia, raises important questions about the state of America's military readiness. Over the past 2 decades, the U.S. military has been stretched thin by long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. While those wars have technically ended, the U.S. military is still heavily involved in global operations, providing support to Ukraine, maintaining a presence in Europe, the Pacific, and now ramping up its involvement in the Middle East. But what does it mean to say the U.S. isn't ready to fight? Macgregor could be referring to multiple factors. First, there's the issue of resources. The U.S. military has expended a tremendous amount of equipment, munitions, and personnel in recent years, and replenishing these stocks takes time. Additionally, many military analysts have raised concerns about the state of U.S. military technology, readiness levels, and the morale of its forces after years of drawn-out conflicts. The second factor is political will. While there are factions within Washington pushing for more aggressive stances toward Russia and other global adversaries, Macgregor suggests that there's still enough restraint to prevent a direct conflict with Moscow. The prospect of a nuclear exchange looms large in this conversation. Both the U.S. and Russia have vast nuclear arsenals capable of destroying life on Earth many times over. No rational actor would risk that outcome. Despite heightened tensions and proxy conflicts, Macgregor believes Washington isn't reckless enough to directly provoke Russia into a nuclear exchange. This restraint may be one of the few things preventing the U.S. from getting dragged into a larger conflict in Eastern Europe. With the U.S. unable or unwilling to engage Russia directly, Macgregor argues that Washington's focus is shifting toward the Middle East, particularly Israel. As he points out, the U.S. is already moving resources, munitions, military assets, and logistical support into the region to back Israel as it prepares for what could be a much larger war. Why is this happening now? According to Macgregor, the groundwork for a regional war has been laid for years. Israel's conflicts with groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and its rivalry with Iran are well documented. However, What we are witnessing now is a potential escalation that could involve multiple countries across the region. Macgregor notes that Netanyahu's goal is to use U.S. military power to neutralize all of Israel's enemies in the Middle East. This includes not just Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon, but potentially Syria, Iran, and other nations that have traditionally opposed Israeli policies. In this sense, Macgregor draws a parallel between Netanyahu's ambitions and those of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who also sought U.S. intervention, albeit unsuccessfully, against Russia. The comparison between Zelensky and Netanyahu is particularly striking. Both leaders have faced existential threats to their countries and have sought U.S. intervention as a means of securing their survival. Zelensky has repeatedly tried to drag the U.S. into a direct conflict with Russia, a nuclear-armed superpower, by highlighting the global stakes of the war in Ukraine. In his speeches, he has framed the conflict as one between democracy and authoritarianism, hoping to convince Washington that American intervention is not only in Ukraine's interest, but also essential for global security. However, Zelensky's efforts to involve the U.S. directly in the war have largely failed. While the U.S. has provided significant military and financial support to Ukraine, it has stopped short of deploying troops or engaging in direct combat with Russian forces. Macgregor suggests that Netanyahu is pursuing a similar strategy, albeit in the Middle East. Israel, like Ukraine, faces numerous adversaries, and Netanyahu has long sought to secure American military support in dealing with those threats. However, unlike Ukraine, Israel has a much closer relationship with the U.S., and Washington has traditionally been more willing to intervene on Israel's behalf. Now, with tensions in Gaza escalating and the larger conflict with Hezbollah and Iran on the horizon, Netanyahu is seeking to draw the U.S. into a broader regional war. Macgregor warns that the U.S. is poised to strike Iran, setting the stage for a much larger and more dangerous conflict. If Macgregor's analysis is correct, the next targets in this escalating conflict could be Iran and Hezbollah. For years, Israel has viewed Iran as its most significant regional threat, particularly due to Iran's nuclear ambitions and its support for anti-Israel militias in Lebanon and Gaza. Hezbollah, a militant group based in Lebanon, is widely regarded as one of Israel's most formidable adversaries, with a vast arsenal of rockets and a well-trained fighting force. In 2006, Israel and Hezbollah fought a brutal 34-day war, during which Hezbollah's rocket attacks reached deep into Israeli territory, and Israeli airstrikes caused significant damage to Lebanon. The recent conflict with Hezbollah and assassination of Nasrallah could draw in Iran, which provides financial and military support to the group. Iran, in turn, could retaliate against Israel leaders directly or through its network of allies across the region. The U.S. role in this potential conflict is critical. Macgregor believes that the U.S. is already preparing for strikes against Iran and Hezbollah. If this happens, it would mark a significant escalation of U.S. involvement in the Middle East and could lead to a wider regional war. The consequences of such a conflict would be devastating, not just for Israel and its adversaries, but for the entire region. Macgregor's warning about the potential for a larger war in the Middle East should be seen in the context of broader U.S. foreign policy. For decades, the U.S. has been deeply involved in the Middle East, from supporting Israel to waging wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each time, these interventions have had far-reaching consequences, often leading to long-term instability and unforeseen outcomes. A full-scale conflict involving Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, and potentially other regional actors would draw the U.S. deeper into the region's complex and dangerous dynamics. The War on Terror, which began over 20 years ago, transformed the Middle East, but it did not bring peace or stability. In fact, it led to the rise of extremist groups, the collapse of states, and the displacement of millions of people. If the U.S. were to intervene militarily on behalf of Israel in a conflict with Iran or Hezbollah, it risks further destabilizing the region, inflaming anti-American sentiment, and deepening divisions between Sunni and Shia Muslim populations. Douglas Macgregor's analysis offers a sobering look at the direction in which U.S. foreign policy is headed. As the U.S. shifts its focus to the Middle East, it is becoming increasingly entangled in Israel's conflicts, risking a much larger and more dangerous war with Iran and Hezbollah. The lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine should serve as a warning. Once the U.S. gets involved in a regional conflict, it is rarely able to extricate itself without significant cost, both in terms of lives and resources. The next few months will be critical in determining whether the U.S. can avoid being drawn into another disastrous war, or if it will, once again, find itself fighting on behalf of an ally in a conflict that could have far-reaching consequences for the entire world. According to Douglas Macgregor, we're not ready to fight anybody right now, certainly not the Russians, so I don't think that's likely to happen. And as deranged and corrupt as I think Washington is at this point, I don't think they're foolish enough to threaten a nuclear exchange with Russia because everyone knows what a nuclear exchange with Russia would create. It would be the end of us. The world that we know would cease to exist. So, I don't think that's likely. I think increasingly the attention is going to refocus now on the Middle East. We are already shifting whatever resources, munitions, and capabilities we have to Israel that is engaged in building the foundation for regional war against all of Islam. That's where we're headed in the Middle East. And the principal goal that Mr. Netanyahu has is very similar to Mr. Zelensky's goal. Mr. Zelensky's goal is always to drag us into war with Russia on his behalf. That has failed. That's not going to happen. Now, Mr. Netanyahu is desperate to drag us into war against all of his erstwhile enemies, which means virtually everybody in the Middle East, and expect us to destroy them for Israel. We are poised to do that. We are poised right now to attack Iran and potentially Hezbollah, and presumably anybody else who decides to raise objections to what Israel is doing in Gaza. Thanks for watching.